So welcome everybody. I'm Geoffrey Miller and I'm here with Dr. Tania Reynolds. She's been here all week visiting University of New Mexico, gave a fascinating talk about female versus female competition and the evolutionary origins of women's psychology and preferences and desires and social strategies. Tania is a postdoctoral researcher at Kinsey Institute at Indiana University. And we've known each other a few years, mostly from the HBAS conferences, Human Behavior and Evolution Society. And I've known some of your mentors and so forth.
Yep.
So we're going to have a conversation for maybe about an hour.
Cool. I'm excited.
And we'll dive into some of the research topics you've covered personally. And then we might branch out as well a little bit into the sort of general perception of evolutionary psychology and the kind of moral psychology of the American intellectual landscape a little bit, maybe something on moral typecasting.
Okay.
We'll see where the conversation goes.
Okay, I'm down.
So, just some background questions. What's your ancestry and where did you grow up?
So I am kind of half Hispanic. My mom is both Mexican and Spanish, and then my dad is Caucasian. And I grew up in Gilroy, California. Garlic capital of the world.
Oh yeah, we used to visit there.
Yeah.
When I was in the Bay Area in grad school.
I'm so proud.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Garlic ice cream.
It's okay. I love the smell though. When you're driving through at sunset, just, I don't know, permeates.
Okay, I didn't know you were a California woman. And then undergrad, you went down
UCLA.
south. Okay. And did you actually work with Marty Hazelton?
I did. That was my first introduction to evolutionary psychology. So I took this year-long freshman seminar course on sexuality and gender. And it was sweet. It was taught by 4 different professors. So one was a biologist, one was a medical doctor, one was a sociologist, and then Marty Hazelton was the evolutionary psychologist. So after taking that class, I got interested in evolutionary psychology and joined her lab.
Okay, cool. Yeah, I've collaborated with her on a couple of projects, mostly ovulatory cycle research, and known her a long time. I was actually a visiting professor at UCLA in 2000.
Sweet.
20 years ago. And then you went to PhD in Florida.
Yes. I love warm weather, so I was delighted. I studied with John Maynor and Roy Baumeister, so that was a really cool experience.
Baumeister is kind of a big deal in social psychology for viewers who don't know.
He sure is, and he's a really fascinating guy. He loves just to think. He'll sit down with you and be like, okay, let's discuss big ideas. And then you'll just feel like, no pressure.
Yeah, and he's worked in lots of different areas of, from sort of willpower to, I guess, social perception to what else has he done?
He's done work on suicide, evil. I loved his book on evil. He's done work on what are men good for.
Oh, yeah. He's kind of like a men's rights advocate in a small way.
A little bit, yeah. And I actually took a class with him on masculinity, and it was really eye-opening because there were just a lot of disparities that I wasn't really aware of. You hear so much more about disparities where women are disadvantaged, and it was interesting to hear kind of a different perspective. We even had Christina Hoff Sommers come to our class, so that was really cool.
Good. So you got exposed to a wide range of theory and methods, and I know evolutionary biology theory informs a lot of your work, but it also seems like you try to weave in some more kind of mainstream social psychology and sometimes even a little bit of gender feminism. A bit.
Yeah, and I don't think they're distinct from one another. So a lot of the claims that feminists make are correct. Our society for hundreds, thousands of years has been male dominated, and women didn't have the same access to cultural resources and educational or occupational opportunities. And so I think the way that you can integrate those is to look at, okay, given this history where women were predominantly forced to fill this role, how have those constraints left traces in modern women's behavior and physiology? So there are ways to connect the two.
Yeah. So it's about thinking about the past, but there's different levels to the past. There's deep genetic evolution past, but there's also recent cultural history. And often it can be hard to disentangle those. But sometimes I guess they pull in the same direction in terms of female versus male roles.
So we might have kind of evolved predispositions to follow certain trajectories, but to the extent that our proximate or cultural experiences reconfirm or confirm those, then you're going to get similar divergences that you would just if you looked at the biological mechanism. So they can operate in conjunction.
So apart from Marty Hazelton at UCLA and Roy Baumeister and John Maynor at Florida State, who have also been kind of big intellectual influences, either people you've met personally or just read their books, watched their videos?
I'd say probably Dave Geary was a pretty big influence. So I read his book, Male Female, and it just changed my mind and just opened it up to the divergence of pressures that our male and female ancestors encountered. And he just really understands sex differences and why they would have evolved, and the different both, opposite sex pressures in terms of sexual selection, but then also same-sex pressures, and how there were different social patterns among men and women, often due to reproductive constraints, and how both of those have contributed to modern sex differences.
So yeah, I also recommend the David Geary book, Male Female. I think there's a second edition now. We'll link it in the comments below.
It's dense.
And maybe also some Baumeister books we can link. Any popular science figures who you found particularly inspiring?
Yeah, I would say Dawkins is a good one. Okay. Yeah, he changed my perspective on evolution, that it's not, you don't need to take the interest of the individual, that in the end it's all linked to the genes. So evolution can favor behaviors that seem on the surface to be maladaptive to the individual, but so long as they forward the propagation of the gene, then that would shift, then that would be favored. So yeah, I would say that Dawkins was pretty influential.
That's a pretty good segue maybe into the topic of social selection. Because there's a lot of puzzling things about human social and sexual interaction that look like, it makes us miserable, and it doesn't really yield personal benefits, but hopefully one advantage of an evolutionary view is you can kind of dig deeper and go, well, might be hidden reproductive benefits somehow. So what is social selection, and how did you get interested in it?
Social selection is it's selection that results in better access to resources. It's not necessarily linked to sexual selection. It can operate through same-sex individuals. So I link it to Jane West Everhard. She was one of the main proponents of it from my perspective, from my reading. And I think why it was so important to my theorizing is it opened my eyes that our same-sex peers can be mechanisms of selection, and that not every behavior is necessarily advantageous from a reproductive standpoint. It might translate into better reproductive opportunities, but we had to also navigate our same-sex peers to reach those opportunities. And so that's influenced my thinking a lot. I'm very fascinated in intrasexual competition.
So there's a long tradition in evolutionary psychology focusing on sexual selection through mate choice, and how do we choose our sexual partners and keep them and sometimes switch. There's also, a lot of work on kind of group versus group competition, warfare, how male coalitions work, particularly in terms of violent competition. But is it fair to say there's been sort of less focus, particularly on female friendships, allies, coalitions within the kind of female sphere?
I think so. I think that we've paid a lot less attention to female adaptations in general, but perhaps specifically the more kind of agentic traits and adaptations, including competition, probably because they are just less overt than men's. So it's easy to notice when men are involved in warfare or physical aggression, and a lot of the female intersexual tactics operate in very subtle ways. And so I'm very fascinated in how perhaps we've overlooked some of the tactics of social competition among women, probably because they're less overt, but they're still there.
So you might even get this reporting bias where anthropologist goes to small-scale tribal society. It's easy to see when the males are fighting.
Mm-hmm.
It's, I guess, a little harder to know what the women are gossiping about and sort of who's in the clique versus out.
Yeah, and I think a huge portion of why it's harder to detect female competitive strategies is because I think women were kind of uniquely navigating both competitive and cooperative spheres in a way that men were not. So men certainly cooperate and compete as well, but those pressures have just been slightly different. So for women, a lot of their competition, I would argue, kind of manifests in cooperative ways. So it's a lot harder to identify that as a competitive tactic.
So it's sort of like my friendship is more committed and intimate and awesome than you guys' friendships, or my clique is cooler than your clique by virtue of how well we cooperate.
Yeah, so one aspect of female cooperative inclinations is because they didn't have the demands of warfare to facilitate large groups, they tended to form more dyadic friendships. And for women, they also had a lot at risk. So if they're the primary caregivers of dependent children, then their children's lives were also on the line. So it's helpful to form probably tighter, more intimate friendships where you can really count on that person. They are not going to harm your child or perhaps your reputation, which is another big manifestation of female-female competition. So women kind of compete to form the more cooperative relationships.
So I guess modern soccer mom level examples of that would be like who gets to be on the cool committee that the PTA is running, or who gets appointed to some particular, or in the corporate world, like who gets to work on the cool project with the cool team, rather than being kind of marginalized to some peripheral product development or app development, whatever. So this thing about women's vulnerability, I think, is something that's both really obvious when you think about it, but isn't really taken that seriously in a lot of psychology. So in your talk, for example, you reported anthropological data showing, look, if you're a dependent kid, a toddler, and your dad dies, that's bad, but it's not as bad as if your mom dies for whatever reason. Can you unpack that a little bit?
Yeah, so you're totally correct that data suggests that children do suffer greater mortality risk if their father isn't present and investing, but they are at a much higher risk if their mother is deceased. So what that meant is that for women who engaged in physical aggression, you're not only risking your own lives, but you're also risking your children's lives. And so Anne Campbell has argued that those reproductive investments, like for women's more predominant role in reproduction, has put constraints on women's competition. Now, I will say that, so people have argued that women will use more indirect and social tactics instead of physically aggressive ones. But Nicole Hess has actually argued that another reason that women might use more indirect tactics, including gossip, is that across history, women's reputation was more vulnerable to slander because many of the aspects of mate choice are harder to confirm, so including sexual chastity.
Right.
Therefore, they were vulnerable in this particular way, whereas for men, if you call a man a coward, he can easily demonstrate otherwise.
Yeah.
Or if you call him, physically weak, he can prove it otherwise. Whereas if you label a woman promiscuous, how can she prove you wrong? So Nicole Hess has made really cool arguments as to why else women's competition might manifest in these social and indirect ways.
Yeah, interesting. Do you think also there might be a little bit of pressure for women to kind of sort out their social relationships among themselves without the local men really kind of knowing what's going on? Because if the men got involved, it could escalate the violence level. Whereas if the men are kind of oblivious to like who's in, who's out, which friendships are under threat, like they won't even know to intervene.
Yeah. And so I think that's a way of aggressing kind of under the radar. And it's possible that a lot of female tactics are designed so men cannot pick up on them. I think one reason that might be the case is it's possible that because men were more often involved in coalitionary warfare, what that meant is they might have biases that favor group cohesion and group harmony, because you can't afford to have petty drama out on the battlefield. You need the group functioning properly. So if that favored psychological mechanisms such that men really dislike group disruptive behavior, they might have low tolerance for conflict within group. And so it's possible that throughout human history, if women were creating conflict, men might have really not approved of it. And there's a huge asymmetry in, the capacity for physical violence and the harm that can be done. So that might have been a selective pressure on women's aggression. Now, I will say there is some work by Martin Muller in terms of chimpanzees where they find this pattern where if there's a foreign female that's introduced to the group, the native females will aggress against her. And so one way that she can protect herself is by allying with male chimpanzees. So it's possible that something like that happens in humans, though it hasn't really been studied yet. So that's an open area.
I think that's fascinating, and it kind of gets to a point that you made about patrilocality and that introducing a distinctive challenge for women. So can you explain what is patrilocality? Like, how common was it, and why would it matter to female psychology?
Yeah, so a wide body of genetic and anthropological data suggests that many human groups, not all, but especially the food-producing and agricultural groups, were patrilocal, meaning that when women were married, they left their family groups to go reside with their husbands. And so what that meant was that for many of our female ancestors, they were surrounded by unrelated individuals, also their in-laws, which meant they didn't have the ties of kinship to facilitate their relationships. Due to that, they had to find other ways of maintaining and sustaining cooperation. So this might have been a selective pressure on women to recruit allies. You might need to signal altruistic tendencies to a greater degree than you would if you were just around kin and you could rely on your kin.
Okay. So it's the same kind of pressure that like young brides in India face of like moving from home village where they have a lot of support to husband's village, maybe nearby, maybe not, but where they don't know anybody. They might not even know the local dialect. Do you think this has to do with women maybe having a better ability to acquire second languages further into life than men?
That's interesting. I hadn't
to do?
I thought about that, but yeah, I think that totally makes sense. There are also a lot of data to suggest that women are better able to pick up nonverbal cues. And so you're right that any advantage that one could acquire in terms of like social tact and really attending to what someone is communicating, perhaps even not even verbally, would be advantageous. This is a very high stress situation, I'm sure, because even though your in-laws might be happy that you will be the future mother of their grandchildren, their interests are more strongly aligned with your children than you, and with your husband than you.
So speaking of going under the radar, you've made the point that a lot of information sharing among women is sort of about managing these complicated relationships. And sometimes you want to sort of derogate another woman, but in a way that has sort of a plausible deniability to it, like subtly slut-shaming another woman. Tell me a little bit more about, like, why would you slut-shame another woman, and how would you do it without everybody knowing that you're doing something really manipulative?
Yeah, so there were, as we kind of mentioned, that there's children faced better survivorship odds if there were a male partner present and investing, especially if he had resources to invest. And so these romantic partners are inevitably limited. Not every man is willing or able to invest. So that presents an incentive for women to compete for the most desirable romantic partners. Now, given this incentive, that also means women could have benefited by poaching another woman's ongoing romantic relationship. If it could better enhance your children's odds of surviving, then you should go for the guy who is able and willing to invest. So what that meant is that women face this incentive to attract and retain these partnerships. And if we know that men, when they're selecting mates, attend to cues, at least throughout history, this is not as true today, but throughout history attended to cues of sexual chastity, then one way by which you could compete for these romantic partners is to call into question another woman's likelihood of being sexually faithful. However, if you are trying to recruit female allies, you do not want to be coming across as this malicious gossiper. And indeed, you find that even among the Chimani, for example, they really dislike female gossipers. And there's a wide body of evidence suggesting we do not like malicious gossipers.
So this is the Tsimane tribal people in Bolivia, and a lot of our University of New Mexico anthropology people have studied them. A lot of my PhD students have gone down there.
So cool.
It's very challenging. But, so they don't like gossipers.
Mm-hmm.
But there can be this utility. If you're a woman, you want that guy, you want to drive a wedge between him and his current mate. So sort of subtly insinuating she's not faithful to him, he's a cuck, whatever, could create an opening.
Mm-hmm.
That's the idea.
Mm-hmm. Or to ward off a rival. So if you're the one in an established relationship and you see someone attempting to poach your mate, you might want to shift the odds against her. So if you can kind of derogate her and make her seem slightly less appealing, maybe your partner would be less likely to abandon you and your children. Yeah. So we got to keep in mind that for women, their children's lives are on the line. So this is consequential. It's not petty, and that's kind of a frustrating thing that's like labeling women's competition. It's like, no, this was very consequential. This could mean your children died. So there was a lot at stake in protecting these relationships. So if you could slightly shift social perceptions such that this woman is now seen as less likely to be sexually faithful, that might have been all the difference between your children having access to resources and not.
I guess if women are doing cooperative childcare also, another way of derogating a rival, not necessarily sexually, would be to say something like, she really doesn't pay very close attention to the kid's safety. I notice she just gets distracted, and it's not really good for you to let her watch your kids. Is that another possible domain of kind of malicious gossip?
Yeah, so it would probably be effective both among men who are considering her as the future mother of their children. Perhaps they'd be less interested to select her as a partner, but it also might be effective in alienating her among women. So if you can't trust this woman to be responsible for your children, then perhaps she would be less likely to recruit female allies.
Okay. And I guess with a lot of these social tactics, it's pretty important for people not to really consciously understand quite what they're doing or why they're doing it. So we have this concept of adaptive self-deception in evolutionary psychology. How self-deceived do you think women are about some of these tactics? And do you think there's some where women are like, yeah, I was kind of trying to do that, but others where they're just completely oblivious to the function of the behavior, but for good adaptive reasons?
Yeah, so I think that for some women who are conscious or who are high in competitiveness, my data suggests that they might use these strategies more explicitly to derogate one another. But what I've argued is that the confluence of these competitive and cooperative pressures might have favored strategies that kind of achieve both goals. And one of those tactics might be self-deception. So if I just believe that I'm concerned about another woman and I tell you that, say, I'm just really worried about her. It seems like maybe she's not careful with who she selects as sexual partners. I don't want her to get hurt. Yeah. You now have the same information than if I had just said she's, promiscuous. I could have been direct, but if I really believe that I'm concerned, you might believe that I am now a trustworthy ally, still a trustworthy ally, but you now have this information about my rival that you wouldn't have otherwise. So it's possible that these cooperative pressures favored self-deception such that the gossiper can earnestly believe she's benevolently motivated, and so can her interlocutor. Now, you've still transmitted the same information that damages your rival's reputation, but you haven't harmed your own social opportunities. If we know people dislike malicious gossipers, then that should have been quite advantageous.
So it's kind of like, oh man, I'm so worried about Becky because, Becky's been sleeping around with all these guys, and, the last time she got a sexually transmitted infection, it was really bad, and I'm just worried that might happen again.
Exactly. Yeah. You could do the same thing with her children, right? I'm just really worried about Becky's children. I mean, the other day I saw them playing near the river, and I'm worried, what if, I wish Becky had just kept an eye on them.
Because there's crocodiles and hippos and
right, and I just wouldn't want them to get hurt. And so you look quite benevolent and nurturing, and you probably are often. The more that you are, and more that you are just earnestly worried, is going to be all the more effective. So evolutionary researchers have argued, like von Hippel and Trivers, that the reason self-deception is advantageous is because it's kind of like the PR system. So you don't need to hold conscious awareness of these, negative traits. And to the extent that you don't, you can better convince social partners otherwise.
Yeah. So it's important for the true executive not to know what the CIA is doing.
Right. So if I have to hold conscious awareness that I am maliciously gossiping and trying to seem concerned, that's going to be quite difficult. We know it's hard to project emotions we aren't feeling. There's a reason we have highly trained and highly paid actors. Yeah. It suggests it's not easy for humans. So one way to accomplish that is just to believe one's benevolence and communicate that, and you don't need to know otherwise.
I'm trying to relate some of this to sort of current issues in feminism and women's movement and maybe the Me Too movement. Mottos like just believe all women. How do you think some of these female kind of social strategies intersect with some of these modern issues? On the one hand, it seems like the Me Too movement has a lot of sort of truly benevolent protectiveness towards vulnerable women who might suffer sexual coercion or rape or date rape, whatever. Do you think, though, there might be a kind of element of, I'm going to do the Becky strategy and kind of make a big show of my concern for these other women, but in a way kind of slightly imply they're a little promiscuous and it's kind of their fault? Do you think there might be an element of that?
It's tough because, so I'm finding in this other line of work that there's this bias to see women as victims. And on one hand, that's reflected by the real pattern of data. So if you look at sexual victimization, it is the case that women are more likely to be victims. But what's interesting is I'm finding that women are more likely to show this bias, such that they're especially concerned for women versus men. And so what I think might be going on is that perhaps throughout human evolution, if our female ancestors were in patrilocal conditions and they needed to recruit female allies, then all else equal, if I'm an ancestral woman, I'm going to prefer another woman who is on team women rather than on team men. And so if I have the choice between two friends and one is saying, I just really care about my male romantic partner, sorry, and the other one is like, no, I really care about women, I'm going to choose her as a friend. If this occurred repeatedly over the course of human evolution, then what that would mean is that would have favored a bias among women to be especially concerned about other women. And it's probably, to the extent that it is corresponding to behavior, genuine. Yeah. And so it's tough in these contexts because I think a lot of it is earnest. Mm-hmm. It can be used to accomplish competitive goals, but I do believe that there's a true bias there where women are just more sensitive to other women's victimization, perhaps because of the selective pressures of ancestral women and their social decisions, who they chose as allies. Now, I think you can use that concern to derogate a rival. Like, so if you wanted to say, I'm really worried about her, I know she's been victimized, you might be ruining her sexual reputation.
Yeah.
But if you're also just saying it in a general term, in general terms, in the abstract, I really care about women, that could be truly earnest, and it might have been favored by our female ancestors when they were making their social decisions.
So I think one of the really interesting takeaways from your research is just to remind psychologists in general, people in general, that, female competition matters just as much to women as male competition matters to men.
Mm-hmm.
And the reproductive and evolutionary stakes were just as high.
Yes.
But it's relatively understudied.
Mm-hmm.
It happens in different ways. It often happens under the radar of male awareness and even under the radar of female consciousness. But it's still worth studying. I mean, one potential domain is, and you got this question after your talk, okay, how does this relate to things like women in science, and are women good mentors to young women, and how effective are women at collaborating, doing research with each other? And then there's, the broader corporate issues about kind of women in the workplace and glass ceilings and so forth. So do you think there's some ways in which this kind of evolutionary legacy does give women advantages in terms of kind of working the social system of science or corporate America, but maybe some other ways where it's a little bit of a handicap or doesn't fit the male dominant culture that well? Yeah,
I think both can kind of be true. So if you look at the top of society, it is the case that there are fewer male professors and world leaders. There are discrepancies, and so when women are advocating for that, there are true discrepancies there, and part of that might be due to some of our cognitive and moral biases to see men as more agentic and more easily see them as leaders. Now, I think that those biases are harmful in these contexts where it does require quite agentic traits, like negotiating on one's behalf, and so those are going to operate against women. But they also can cut both ways in that if we think in the moral domain, if women are not seen as agentic, it's easier for us to place them in the victim role. And so it's going to be easier for women to recruit sympathy and social resources over their negative outcomes than it would be for men. And so when we do have disparities, it's going to be easier for us to detect those when they're falling against the favor of women and recruit support and resources. Now, I think one question that we haven't addressed is to what degree other women's social behaviors might exacerbate some of those discrepancies. So, for example, Joyce Benenson has some really interesting research looking at female-female friendship and even collaboration among scientists. So she's found this pattern that female friendships are more likely to dissolve than men's. She's also found this pattern mostly with children, but I think she's done some work with adults too, showing that girls tend to have less tolerance for newcomers, same-sex newcomers, than do boys. But she's also shown even in kind of competitive environments that competition more strongly corrodes female-female relationships. So she's done this interesting work with athletes, finding that after a competition, male athletes will engage in more affiliative behavior after the competition, whereas female athletes will be less likely to. And then she's shown even that in same-sex roommates, female roommates are more likely to request a switch to their university than are male roommates, suggesting that instances of competition might more strongly corrode female-female relationships than men's, which makes sense if we think about our evolutionary history. A lot of men's bonds were fused in contexts of competition through warfare. So the competition itself brought you closer, and the extent that it did meant that you were a more formidable threat to your opposing group. Now, for women, if you had to recruit committed and kind allies, competition might have just signaled, this woman won't have my interest or will defect when it's her self-interest to do so. And indeed, what Joyce Bennenson's work has found is that even in science, she finds this pattern where female senior faculty are less likely to co-author a paper with same-sex junior faculty than are male senior faculty. So male senior faculty are more able to co-author or more likely to co-author papers with same-sex junior faculty. And what I think this is suggesting is not only competition, but also a disparity in status might be more corrosive to female-female bonds. And this makes sense if we think about if many of our female ancestors were forming dyadic relationships and exchanging in either using reciprocal altruism or mutually aligned goals, clear discrepancies in goals or status might have been corrosive to cooperation. And so there are some data to suggest that those patterns are playing out now in a modern world.
So it sounds like it's really important to understand a lot of the complexities of these female-female interactions, just to even start asking the right questions about things like, everyone in academia knows, at least in sciences, not necessarily humanities, but in the sciences, collaboration is key. Like the more good collaborators you have, and the more collaborators across different seniority levels, like full professors down to undergrads, the more productive you are. So understanding, male versus female patterns of like how do collaborations succeed or fail, and maybe how does that reflect sort of tendencies of female versus male alliances and friendships seems pretty important to act if you want to actually solve these problems rather than just sort of whinge about them.
Right. Yeah, so that's one of the goals of my current research is I'm trying to look at female-female cooperation and what predicts its dissolution. And what I'm finding is this pattern where women compared to men are slightly more sensitive about cues of cruelty or defection, so disloyalty. That seems to be the transgressions that they're most sensitized to, which would make sense in terms if we think of these, especially like our history of patrilocality, that women needed to pretty carefully decide who has my back and who can I really count on and who can't I. And so if it's the case that that history leaves a legacy in our modern minds, then what that would suggest is that if you really care about promoting female ascension of the hierarchy or female cooperation, we have to first understand what factors corrode it. And it might be this sensitization to cues of disloyalty. And if we have that information, then we can more effectively design interventions. So one solution might be, think of all the ways through which a female friend or collaborator has demonstrated her loyalty instead of focusing on all the ways in which she's demonstrated disloyalty. And so if you implement that, perhaps, just like maybe through CBT or something, how can we refocus our concerns? Then perhaps then we can better foster female-female cooperation.
So a lot of male viewers might be going, my brain is so full, female-female competition, it sounds so intricate and subtle and crafty, and I don't get it. You've also thought, though, about male coalitions and warfare and so forth. How important do you think warfare was in human evolution?
I think it was hugely important. If we look at, even today, who is off at war? Predominantly men. Now, in modern times, we now have women involved in our armed forces, but throughout history, these battles were often fought by men. And it's probably the case that patrilocality was useful in facilitating those coalitionary bonds such that men were more often surrounded by kin, so they could have a greater strength to their male-male bonds, which would be advantageous out on the battlefield. Now, if men were often competing in groups, and this competition was highly consequential, so it meant whether your entire tribe would be slaughtered or at least all the men would be slaughtered, then this surely should have left traces in modern minds and behavior. And so even if you look, for example, genetic analyses have tracked like the Y chromosome, you can see that the men who won on the battlefields replaced the losing groups of men in the population. And so what that means is that perhaps a decent portion of men's same-sex psychology is designed to recruit same-sex allies who would have been useful on the battlefield. So attending to cues of who would make a good warrior. Who do I want on my team? So men might be attending to cues of courage, pain tolerance, dominance, all else equal, groups of men who are more courageous, have a higher tolerance for pain, and who are more dominant are going to be more successful on the battlefield. So some portion of male psychology might be designed to more effectively recruit strong, cohesive, aggressive groups.
And it seems like you can see this in TV series and movies and all kinds of popular entertainment. Men just have this laser-like focus on, oh my God, battle scene, combat scene, one-on-one combat, big group battle, but also kind of formidability indicators like, oh, he's the hero. We introduce the hero by showing how good he is at fighting, right? How masculine and pain tolerant and stoical he is. You've done a paper where you've talked about how that whole male attention towards would he be good by my side in a battle, how that might play into homophobia. Mm-hmm. Tell us a little more about that.
Yeah, so if you look at the pattern of anti-gay bias, it's not monolithic. So you find that men are more likely to show anti-gay bias than are women, but it's particularly towards gay men rather than lesbian women. And so what my colleagues and I argue is that perhaps part of this bias is stemming from a history of coalitionary combat, such that men are aiming to assess the cues of who would be an advantageous warrior, and sexual orientation might be one proxy. So men might be using the assumption that a gay man is lacking in these coalitionary advantageous traits. So courage, pain tolerance, they're essentially using sexual orientation as a rough cue of masculinity. Now, to test this, we manipulated male targets' sexual orientation and their coalitionary ability. So how masculine, tough, dominant, resistant to pain is he? And we asked men, who would you like as your teammate? And so what we found is that men more strongly attended to cues of coalitionary value, who's going to be a good warrior, more than they did sexual orientation. And this is especially true if the nature of the competition requires formidability, like football or warfare, and so that's exactly what you would predict if men are using sexual orientation as a rough cue of this coalitionary ability, that when you have more direct information about someone's coalitionary ability, then you should attend to those signals rather than sexual orientation. And so this is what you see too when, athletes will come out as gay. Often they're quite well received. And I think that would be because these men have displayed their coalitionary value in other domains, that their sexual orientation is just less consequential at that point.
So if you're like in an NFL team and one of your teammates who you know, trust, and respect, and who has had your back and made interceptions for you, he comes out as gay, you're like, that's cool. Yeah. No problem, dude.
You do you.
Whereas if the sexual orientation seems correlated with effeminacy or weakness, or like not pulling your weight in the Bronze Age phalanx or whatever. And it is kind of striking that the homoeroticism you saw in ancient Greece was very much part of the warrior culture. Mm-hmm. Like, okay, Achilles and Patroclus can have their little gayish thing going on, whatever, but they're both awesome warriors who are a credit to the side, so that's their business. Mm-hmm. Is that kind of the idea?
Yeah, and throughout history, they tended, when they attended to homosexual interactions, they often made a distinction between who is the recipient, because that was associated with being the more effeminate role, and who was the penetrator, and then they weren't questioned as often. And so if you want to use this logic to reduce anti-gay bias, then I think one effective way might be broadening the lens of what is advantageous to the coalition. So if you can demonstrate to men that these less traditionally masculine roles are critical to the success of a coalition, then men might be attending less to cues of like formidability or traditional warfare traits. So if you say, for example, strategy is integral to the group's success, it doesn't matter if you have great warriors if you don't have good strategy, and just kind of broadening what is advantageous to the coalition, then perhaps that would broaden the traits that men view as advantageous, and they'd have less strict definitions of what it meant to be a real man, and that, who is benefiting our coalition.
So it seems, for example, like we have this kind of leftover impression from prehistoric warfare, which was largely kind of muscle-based, and it had to do with body size, upper body muscles, impact weapons, sort of mixed martial arts, basically. But a lot of that is not that relevant, because once you get projectile weapons like spears and then bows and arrows, you can be a highly effective archer and not have a sort of classical warrior physique. And I've always found it interesting, like in Lord of the Rings, Legolas, the master archer, the elf, he's obviously kind of the most effeminate looking of the warriors, but in terms of actual body count, he's like right up there. And maybe it doesn't matter if your siege engineer is gay, as long as he figures out like these trenches and fortifications will be very effective and then save the lives of 100 warriors. So it seems like we need to kind of update our concept of what is formidability.
And perhaps we have. So it'd be really interesting to look at among cultures, for how long have you been in, man-to-man conflict versus how long have you had projectile weapons or more, complicated technology? And perhaps that would be correlated with their level of anti-gay bias or their stricter definitions of masculinity. And that would make sense. And what you would predict is in a modern environment, there might be a delay in catching up, but now it probably matters much more, who your engineers are to how well your society is going to do. Yeah. So if we can just kind of make those traits like salient and clear that they are valuable to the success of our broader coalition, whether it's our nation or the human race, then hopefully that type of language, this is a warrior. This is what a warrior looks like. Just broadening our conception of it, perhaps that would be helpful in integrating a broader array of men into society and enhancing their value.
Yeah. I teach a lot of undergrads who are actually veterans and like they've served time in Iraq or Afghanistan, they come back, start college, whatever. And it's striking that, the view of people who've actually served in the military often seems to be body size doesn't really matter that much. If everybody has rifles, body size isn't that relevant. Mental toughness is relevant. Accuracy, like keeping your weapon in good shape, like knowing how tactics work, that's all relevant. But I don't think you have the same kind of worship of a kind of Conan the Barbarian physique in people who have actually been in combat with modern weapons. So we both work in a highly stigmatized field. Right, evolutionary psychology is actually quite a small part of psychology overall, but we do get a lot of popular attention and everybody has a view for or against psych. Why do you think there's a kind of moral typecasting where it seems sometimes like evolutionary psychology is thought of as like the big bad wolf? It's this huge force of nature that has colossal power, and it's victimizing poor innocent people. What do you think is going on, given that there's literally less than 1,000 people in the world doing psych research?
Yeah, so I think a few factors play into it. It might be the case that it's seen as condoning negative traits or behaviors. So if we understand why something evolved, it might be interpreted that we are supporting it. You know, if we look at some of the nefarious aspects of human nature, whether it's aggression, sexual coercion, and we're trying to explain why that might have evolved, it's as though people assume we're approving of it. But I think actually in reality, that information can be used to ameliorate the issues. So if we understand what factors are activating them, or who's most likely to engage in them, why would they be, then you can better address the problem.
Like, it was really striking with the controversy here 20 years ago when my colleague Randy Thornhill published The Natural History of Rape. And this controversy blew up, and a lot of people were very distressed about the claim that rape may have been common and important throughout prehistory. And they kind of judged the book without even reading the first page. On the first page, Randy says, the whole goal of this book is to eliminate rape from human life. But we think you can only do that if you understand it. And I've never met a proper working evolutionary psychologist who thinks that just because something bad evolved, that it's morally licensed. I don't know, maybe there's people out there like the guys in the manosphere and the pickup artist scene and the red pill guys who sort of get like third or fourth hand evolutionary psychology, and they think, oh, well, like, I guess alpha males existed, so I should try to be one, right? Or dominance was important in primates, so I must be dominant and never submit. Do you think that's sort of the source of a lot of the problem, is not like DevPsych itself, but how it's kind of interpreted?
Yeah, perhaps people are worried that the information can be used malevolently, but I wonder if maybe a link to typecasting here would be, it's kind of seeing individuals as agentic versus if you take a sociocultural perspective, it tends to perceive individuals as like these passive recipients of external forces. And although that can certainly be true, even if you take the agentic role, I think that can be useful, or agentic perspective. You can say, okay, if it is the case that individuals are enacting these behaviors, then how can we reduce them? Now, to just take a passive approach, then I don't even know what one does with that. Like, if we're just the victims of these strong environments, that also seems, I don't know, kind of pessimistic that, oh, we just are the product of culture, that we have no say in what happens to us. So it's kind of odd that people have that perception, but I think it's very, very important to understand why a trait evolved, so then we can detect the predictors of it and the manifestations of it, and then better design interventions. It doesn't help anyone to deny reality. So if those evolutionary origins are true, and they are playing out in the world, then it's in our interest to understand them. To deny it isn't doing anyone any favors. So it's a bit paternalistic that, like, oh, we can't handle the source of this information. I would argue that if we have the information, then we can utilize it to make the world more harmonious, or whatever our goal is.
Yeah. And you've given some great examples of that. Like, if you understand the intricacies of female competition, it could actually help inspire longer lasting, more fruitful female collaborations in science. If you really understand the roots of homophobia in coalitional warfare, that could help us understand how to reduce it. One thing I've been struck by is people kind of stereotype evolutionary psychology as sort of a masculine endeavor. But I think our field is basically 50-50, or maybe even slightly female dominated in terms of grad students and younger faculty. What's it like to be a woman working in evolutionary psychology, maybe even particularly versus what you've seen in some other areas of psychology?
Yeah, I think in some ways it helps to be a woman, because there's something about the deliverer of the information. I think in some ways you get a pass if you're a woman making these claims that you would not if you were a man making identical claims. I think on the other hand, people don't really understand it. I think their stereotype of female academics is that they take more of a sociocultural perspective, and So they'll just assume you have this interpretation, and then when you say otherwise, they're kind of caught off guard. But to be honest, I find it more of an asset that perhaps it makes the message slightly more palatable. Whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, I think it's honestly kind of too bad that men can't make identical claims. But yeah, perhaps that's playing a role in this kind of pathologizing of evolutionary psychology, is I think people make this assumption that if you study factors like mate choice, you must be this sexist male. And it's like, no, actually, a lot of evolutionary psychology is about how we are cooperative and why we're so cooperative or altruistic. Like, we also study very beautiful aspects of human nature, and when we study the negative aspects, it's to forward the goal of bettering the human condition. So it's really too bad that the evolutionary psychologists are kind of stereotyped in the way that they are. So I'm hoping that changes over time as we begin to see the utility of taking this approach. Like, the more that we can integrate evolutionary psychology in concrete interventions, then perhaps people will shift their mindset and start to see it as more benevolent.
One thing I've sort of noticed in evolutionary psychology is there's at least a subset of women, I think they include like my wife Diana Fleischman, they include you, who are willing to contemplate very unpolitically correct ideas and willing to talk kind of openly about some of the trickier, more controversial aspects of human life, but in probably ways that surprise other people, both men and women. Do you ever have moments where you're like talking to male academics and they like suddenly have the realization, oh, Tania's the kind of woman I can actually talk openly about topic X, Y, and Z with, and I don't have to self-censor the way that I do with certain other female colleagues? Is that an experience you've had?
Yeah, I do, and it's interesting. Like, I think you can see them just kind of be like, okay, I don't need to self-monitor. I can say my thoughts. And for the most part, I'm not trying to detect I'm just interested in reality, whatever the truth is. And so I'm not attributing malevolent intentions on the part of others. And I guess I'm just trying to go into it with like granting people the benefit of the doubt, but also just curious about what is true. And I think I'm just lower in like moral outrage or tendency to be activated, I'm sure.
How much of an advantage do you think it is for a woman in science to create that kind of sense of openness with colleagues where, they realize she's not going to react the way a typical social justice warrior or sort of woke scientist might react?
I think there are positives and negatives. It kind of depends on who you're interacting with. With some people, it's great because then they can share ideas with you that you might not have heard otherwise. And you can come up with really cool study designs or hypotheses. So that can be really advantageous. And I think it does put people at ease. But then I've noticed in other instances where, depending on how progressive someone is, they almost detect it as like a sign of disloyalty, like you are an outsider. You must not care about humanity, or you must not see the world the way that we do, or you don't care about injustices.
So it's kind of a betrayal of our female coalition.
Yeah. And it is. It does seem to be perceived that way. So it really depends who you're interacting with. And I hope that by having those interactions, I can show people that like, no, just because you don't take the same approach doesn't mean we don't have the same goals, because I think I share the same goals with feminists. It's just a different approach to how we get to the solution. And so I hope that those perspectives will change over time.
Yeah. So 2020, it's an exciting time to be alive in terms of science, technology, the kind of globalization of science, the rise of like China and India, etc. What potential kind of scientific insights and discoveries in the next 20 years are you kind of most excited about seeing or perhaps bracing for?
I think I'm most interested in genetics. I think over time we're just going to learn more and more about the correlation between our genes and our phenotype. And I'm hoping that because it is individualized, it'll actually promote acceptance of genetics. So, we'll realize that there's more nuance than sex, more nuance than race. We just have the more direct cue we're trying to assess. On the other hand, I'm also very, very worried about it because I think that we're going to find genetic correlation between these groups. So it's going to take people who are aware of these correlations to preempt these social issues and remind people that no, the thing that you're really attending to is the traits at the end of the day. People throughout history have used demographic groups as a proxy of those traits, and perhaps there's some truth on average, but we're going to have more nuanced information than that. I'm curious to see what control we'll have over our genotype, whether things like CRISPR will pan out. I'm both worried and excited about it. I like the idea that we can alleviate needless suffering from the world by getting rid of these single gene mutations. But I'm also concerned about disparate access to that technology. So I'm not sure. I'm kind of excited and worried.
Yeah, it seems like with the new genetic information, certain parts of the society seem kind of ready to accept it, like no big deal. We all knew that there's going to be those differences. It lines up with our intuitions. But then among the elites, right, there's real polarization. Like there's a sort of blank slate leftist in the Stephen Jay Gould mold who's like, we can't handle the truth. Those people out there, of course we enlightened geneticists will be able to interpret the results appropriately, but there's this latent fascist tendencies and xenophobia and tribalism out there. They won't be able to handle the genetics. I don't know, it doesn't accord with my experience, because when I talk to normal folks, they seem to have pretty reasonable views about most of these things, and they think it's all partly genetic, but we should still try to be nice to each other. Do you think the kind of blank slaters really create a kind of moral panic around this?
Yeah, it's definitely, on one hand, I can see the concerns. It's good to be cautious because it has been used nefariously in the past. So I understand the concern, but I do think it's not giving people enough credit. If we think about, for example, learning about the genetic link between, with alcoholism, I would say, if anything, that's made us more compassionate. We understand that you can't just tell someone, pull yourself up by your bootstraps. No, this is very, very challenging for some people. And I don't think we've fully acknowledged how broadly that extends. So even now, the way that we talk about ambition, as though it's just entirely within someone's control. We'll see when the genetic data come out, but if it's not, then we've been treating people rather poorly under the assumption that all of these life outcomes are just a matter of wanting it more. Yeah. And so I actually think that once we have this information, we can design our world much more compassionately, whether it's in terms of IQ or ambition. We can acknowledge the true range of variation and make the world much more accessible than it is now when we have this assumption that we're all identical and all have the same potential.
Yeah. I think that's right. I think really understanding genetic differences teaches a lesson of compassion and acceptance of, there's lots of different kinds of people with different preferences and desires and personalities, and hey, that's okay. Whereas I think some elitists assume, hey, if you can't level everyone up to learn to code and to be maximally ambitious and pursue the American dream gung-ho, then there's actually something kind of wrong with them, Okay, it's been a great conversation. Thank you.
It has. Thank you.
And we'll add a bunch of links to some of this material in the comments. And hope we can do this again sometime.
I hope so too.
Thanks.
Thank you.